Hey everyone, it's the Eclectic Dev. Today we're going to put on our AI hats and have a first look at GitHub Copilot using Angular inside of VS Code. Let's check it out. All right, so I'm inside one of my open source applications that's built using modern Angular, and I want to test out what it's like using GitHub Copilot. Now, GitHub Copilot is this next evolution in us as developers, being able to have an assistant there that's going to be right in line with us working, as opposed to maybe having to jump out to the internet and search or read different articles. We can get that quick, on the spot help from our AI assistant. Now, GitHub Copilot breaks down into kind of two larger pieces of functionality. You have the GitHub Copilot Chat component, and you also have the inline capabilities within your code directly. In VS Code here, we're going to need two extensions in order to enable that. This also is with the precursor that you have a license already identified with your GitHub login. I already do have a license that I can use, so I just need to get the extensions installed, log into GitHub, and we'll be on our way. So if I go to extensions here, it will probably already be under recommended. You can see GitHub Copilot. So we're going to go ahead and install that one. The other one that I want to get at is Copilot Chat. And so if we take a look at that, we will see that as well. And both are being installed. So now if I go back over to my extensions, I should be able to see that both are available. All right, after both extensions have been installed, it'll say right here to sign in to GitHub. We can do that, and it will allow me to do that. It'll pop me out to the browser, and then we can continue on looking at the functionality. All right, so once authorized, I'm redirected back to my application, and we can do that once again. Reopens Visual Studio Code, and okay, so now we are authenticated with GitHub, and the way that we can tell that Copilot is ready for us is down here in the bottom right. Show Copilot status menu. So if I click that, status ready. So we know that GitHub Copilot is ready for us to use. Now it's time to start using it within our code. One other note about Copilot inside of VS Code, it does have some configurability. If you go to File, Preferences, and then Settings, under the Extensions menu, you will have some options for Copilot. You can actually enable and disable particular parts of the features or the different languages, and you can take a look at those if you want for additional modifications, but for today we'll be using the default settings. All right, so I have this dashboard component, and I first want to highlight how does the inline sort of super intelligence really, because that's what we're looking at here, work. So the autocomplete, the Copilot, the pair programmer that's going to help me out. So in this particular file, I have an observable that's leveraging a subscription that has been defined. However, this subscription, as we know in Angular, we need to clean it up after it's been used in a component. In this particular instance, maybe I don't remember the exact syntax, or I don't remember, which method it goes into or event. So what I can do is begin typing a comment. It already actually gives me IntelliSense. So do you want a callback for when cabin data is loaded? Technically, I already have that one below, but I want to say create a function to clean up. Now look at that. After just putting in most of the sentence, it's already starting to understand what I'm after. And in this case, it says clean up the subscription. I can tab on that and then hit enter. Now it's going to recommend the function that it thinks that I want. I can tab to accept, or I can hit Control Enter, and it will give me the suggestions over here. So there are multiple suggestions after I hit Alt Enter. This is known as the completions pane in GitHub Copilot. So over here, it shows me a couple of different suggestions. And in this case, it looks like just about all of them are identical. Let's see. Oh, and this one has checking to see if, if it exists. So you could pick which one of these if you needed additional suggestions, or I could go back and again, I can just tab and get the method that I want. So inline, I've just made a comment, had Copilot recommend the method, the function that I needed, and I was able to accept it in just very few characters. You can see how rapidly we could leverage this functionality. All right, let's look at some of the additional functionality that Copilot offers. Here inside this method, maybe I need additional logic on cabins loaded. So this particular method provides me with a collection of cabin data. So what I can do is I could say, maybe I only want the cabins with an occupancy, that's one of the properties on it, that is greater than 4. So I need to do something with that. So I can just say get cabins with an occupancy. Now, it already has recommended something of the sort. It says with an occupancy of 4 or less. Now, in my case, I want 4 or more. So I'm just going to modify that, hit enter, and then it's offering me a method or an additional call here using data.filter, which is just plain JavaScript, which it can pare down only the cabins that have an occupancy greater than or equal to 4. Now, in addition to that, if you continue, it already knows, do you want to sort that now? So maybe I want to sort that. I could tab on that, and then it will tell me using data.sort, it's going to sort by the occupancy. So now that data has been pared down for occupancy greater than or equal to 4 and been sorted so that maybe if I was binding in my view or something of that nature. So you can see how you can prompt it, and even just your initial prompt, sometimes it's almost like it's finishing your sentences. Like it knows you so well, it knows the application and the context of this file of what you may be needing to do. And if it's off a little bit, you can make some slight modifications and then get the code that you need to. All right, now that we've seen the inline functionality and a few examples, it's time to look at GitHub Copilot Chat. So if you don't see it already over on the left-hand side, you will see that there is a chat option. So here is the chat option, and we can ask it anything that we want to assist us. And there are lots of prompts that you can help it out, like fix or test or explain, and it'll guide you through that. Now, in this case, what I want to take a look at are, if I go back to this dashboard component, if I look at the spec in the unit test, it's pretty anemic. I have the default scaffolded that it just should create the component. But in reality, I want to make sure that some of this code has been tested directly in ng on init with the observable and on the callback for on cabins loaded. All right, so within the GitHub Copilot chat window here, there's several ways we can prompt it for unit tests for a given file. So right now I have the dashboard component file open, and I could simply do one of the slash commands like /tests, or I could be more specific as I have here. So I said, write additional unit tests for dashboard component. So let's take a look at exactly what it provided to me in this instance. So this is the key part about when you're using GitHub Copilot, that you're not necessarily going to take everything verbatim. So we know we have somewhat of an anemic test over on the right because all we have is it should create. Now let's take a look at what it's done. All right, so right here we can see we've got the typical setup, and before each it's creating some mock cabins. It's using Jasmine to create a spy on the get cabins and get cabins changed. It is providing that mock cabin service using use value in the test bed. And then we have a series of unit tests here. It's good. It's basically repeated the original one. Then there are 2 new ones. Should call get cabins on ng init. So here it's looking that it's on that mock cabin service, calling get cabins, and should return a value. And after the fixture detect changes, it wants to make sure that it's called. So that ensures that get cabins has been called, which we want it. So that's okay. And then here it should update cabins when on cabins loaded is called, which that refers to the callback from the observable expecting cabins to equal. So one of the iterations that I want to make, while I don't mind this right here, I prefer to use mock classes. So the very next statement that I have right here is refactor the above to use a mock class instead of a Jasmine spy for cabin service. And GitHub Copilot knows what I'm asking. Sure, here's how you can refactor the test to use a mock class instead. This is the typical pattern I use in this application, and many of my applications, but maybe you would have been all right with the original setup. So it takes that same setup, but now we have class mock cabin service. So it has the mock up of these different values from the real cabin service, including some mock data. Now I can already sense that there's a problem here because the cabin model, which is over here, has several more properties. So we're probably going to get an issue on that. But again, this is why it's an iterative process. So going back over, let's take a look. But so far, so good overall. And so we go down into the test bed provider. And now this is what I want to see. Instead of use value, use class with mock cabin service. And then we have the unit test. Now, one thing that did change over here is now on cabins loaded is using some of that mock data directly rather than from what was up here, checking on it to be identical and then subscribing and making sure that that is equal. All right, so in order to use this, there's several ways. You can just cut and paste pieces in there, but since my test over here really didn't have a lot of merit, what I can do is select everything right here. And then I like this step right here. So I'm going to hover over and insert at cursor. All right, so that has now overwritten and added to that file the unit test that we wanted right here. All right, a couple of errors that I need to fix. So I don't think we have the correct references. So I'll just take care of that right now. Go over here to cabin and we'll just use the little light bulb here and say add import that we need, and that'll take care of that. And we also need cabin service, so we can add the input that we needed for that. All right, and also it's going to tell us down here, we've got a couple of different problems with that data as we had expected. So this is pretty cool because instead of iterating over in the GitHub Copilot Chat, at this point, what we can do, I can give myself some more real estate here. If I hover over this, you'll notice now it'll say fix using Copilot or explain using Copilot. I also could take the error and put it over in the Copilot window over here and say, what is this error? It would explain it, and then I could continue to refactor the test. So at this point, you might be saying, isn't it faster just to hand roll this? Well, obviously I'm explaining as I go along, but there's an ebb and flow quickly. And depending on what type of test you're trying to create, it may be good as gold the first time and might be able to push it into the file and you can proceed. But in this case, we needed a few changes. So let's go ahead and say fix using Copilot. And it knows that there are additional properties that are going to be needed to fix it. I would update the object layer will include the missing properties. So we'll accept that, and then we'll come down here and we should be able to do the exact same thing using a Copilot, and we will get the same response, and we can accept that on both of those. Now, at least visually, we don't have any errors in our unit test. So I want to go ahead and run my unit tests, and I'll just run on Chrome headless, and we will see what kind of output that we get. So Angular has built the application, serving it up on Chrome headless, and we will get our results here on the new unit tests that we've added to our application. And there we go. We have 18 successful unit tests ran in the application, and we know the new ones added have worked as well. And if needed, we could use the code coverage report from Karma to go ahead back and check our code and make sure that we're getting the code coverage that we need using our unit tests. So that's a lot of focus on GitHub Copilot, creating unit tests and helping us, especially when it comes to observables and some of that async code that we want to test. This can greatly help us along. And once you get that pattern down, you can wash, rinse, repeat in some of the others. So now we know that Cabin's observable will be updated after the callback, and we have that proper code coverage rather than just the anemic on create that we had originally. One of the other things I wanted to mention about GitHub Copilot are the different models that they use behind the scenes. So the inline functionality I've shown uses GPT-3.5, whereas GitHub Copilot uses GPT-4. But sometimes you'll still notice that the data that they've been trained on isn't necessarily bleeding edge. So for example, in this file right here, dashboard component, what if I wanted to use the newer Angular signals to convert that observable over to an Angular signal? So if I prompt it and say, update the Cabin's observable to use Angular signals instead of an observable, and prompt GitHub Copilot for it, let's see what it ends up responding with. And it says here, in Angular, observables are used to handle async, HTTP, and other user events. And as soon as it comes back, and it'll say, Angular doesn't have a built-in alternative to observables for handling these types of operations. And then it talks about the different types of observables that could be used. While this is not technically valid at this very moment, because we do have an alternative in the way of using signals as of the newest version of Angular. So that's just one thing to know, that you're not necessarily working on bleeding edge data learning that for behind these models. So you'll just want to work with it, and may still have to hand roll some of your solutions. Another feature to highlight of GitHub Copilot, and this is even beyond Angular, it really doesn't matter what language that you're using, but specific to VS Code, is just how many avenues into the functionality of GitHub Copilot there are between the chat, inline, prompts. And I wanted to show one more thing here with explaining code, because obviously, how many people get into new code and they're like, what is this code doing? Sometimes there's comments, sometimes there's docs. Most of the time there's not. Now you can make your way through the code by reading it and figuring out what it's doing and debugging, but it sure is nice if you can very quickly get a definition of what something's doing. For example, this admin cabin component that I have open uses Angular material. It opens up a dialog, and then when you click it, there's a callback and some information gets returned to the component that's hosting it. But I may not understand what this open dialog function is doing. And I can see here that we've got this dialog ref with a reference after it's been open with some properties on it, and then the subscription, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on. So I can highlight the entire method, right click, say Copilot, and then explain this. Over in my chat, it's going to begin working, shows which references are being used, and it will begin to explain out block by block what exactly is going on. So as soon as it finishes here, we're going to take a look and see how well it did at explaining what it's actually doing. All right, so it wrote almost a blog post on my one method right here, which is pretty interesting. So it gives the name and is used to open the dialog for editing the details, takes a cabin object as a parameter, and we can see that right here, represents the cabin the user wants to edit. That's pretty neat to have that context. You may have not known what that was for. Dialog open method, open the dialog, part of Angular Materials Mat dialog service. It is the component that should be used. That's this one right here. It's explaining what the parameters are, and it continues to go on. Callback function checks if the result was returned, continues on, also talks about selecting or deselect. So it deselects the row, finds the index, moves along, and finally it refreshes the grid by creating a new mat table data source with the updated grid data array. This is really, really spectacular to me. I mean, over 20 years of doing coding, and a lot of times you're coming in behind a mad scientist of sorts that you don't know and has written code, and you see a bunch of wires, and everybody proclaims that code should be self-describing, but in reality, it's not always the case. So GitHub Copilot here has, in my opinion, exceptionally done a good job of providing context. Now, it's not going to be everything. That doesn't mean that you know how to make changes on the code, especially if you're a junior developer or something. But especially if you're a seasoned developer, you'd be able to look at that and understand exactly what it's doing. And again, you could do that on anything. You could even just go to a particular row and you could say, Copilot, explain this. You could start an inline chat right there and say, I want to modify this. I showed that at the beginning. So it's pretty handy if you've got that GitHub Copilot chat over here. And I could see this being open indefinitely in my application for the ebb and flow to go back and forth. I may not need to explain my own code, but if I'm hopping through, and especially if you're still doing like a method where maybe you're going out to Stack Overflow and you're taking some code and you're pasting in your application, you want that additional clarification on what it's actually doing before you use it, this is a way that you could get further insight into it. So anyway, I've shown from multiple angles, kind of getting you started with an Angular application on how we can enhance it, add code, add unit tests, explanations, the different functionality, and this is just really scraping the surface. Try it out for yourself. Get it into VS Code. You can also use it in Visual Studio. So if you're doing Angular over there, web client development, or Blazor, or whatever you're doing, this functionality is not limited to VS Code. Hopefully you found this useful. There's a lot of learning ahead to be done on this, and try it out, see how it works for you. And until next time, this is the Eclectic Dev. We'll see you later.